Welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. These are ALTA's presentations we offer every month on issues important to title professionals. I'm Jeremy Yohe, ALTA's Vice President of Communications, and we've got a great webinar lined up today to help you improve your company's security with use of multi-factor authentication. Before starting, just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's presentation can be downloaded from the GoToWebinar handouts section. All participant lines are muted for today's presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them through the questions box, and we'll hold a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. As an added benefit, the presentation is being recorded. After we've got the file processed, you'll get a link to the recording probably tomorrow, and all of our webinars are archived on the ALTA's website at alta.org/title topics. Again, that's alta.org/title topics. I need to thank FNF Family of Companies for sponsoring our webinars this year. Their support allows us to continue providing these educational opportunities free of charge. And with that out of the way, let me briefly introduce today's speakers. First, we have Steve Hargraves. Steve is co-founder and COO of ShortTrack. ShortTrack offers many products to the title industry. Kind of trying to summarize it, it basically streamlines the way title agents receive orders from real estate agents, and also allows for the secure delivery of wire instructions. And also joining us is ShortTrack's other co-founder and CTO, Chris Hacker. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Steve to get us going.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Can you hear me all right?
Sound fantastic.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Fidelity as well again to start this off, and thank ALTA. And let's get into talking about multi-factor authentication. Just to review the topics, why use it, what tips you should have about it, how to implement it, best practices, and is MFA enough? So why should we use multi-factor authentication? I always like to start things off with a quote. This one's from Dr. Barbara Edekapovsky. The days of fixing this with a firewall or IT patch are over. This is an arms race, and that's true. You always got to keep up with the criminals. And so multi-factor is the latest way to do that, and it's fairly inexpensive and easy to implement. That's why everyone should be doing it. So why multi-factor? What we're talking about here is identity theft. And identity theft is an easy, low risk, high reward crime. It's the fastest growing type of crime, now more profitable than any drug related crime. And weaker stolen passwords and credentials are the most common way these criminals go about doing this. And one of the ways they do these attacks is through an attack called credential stuffing. And that's when an attacker takes advantage of the fact that users often use the same new username and password on multiple accounts, and then use those stolen credential pairs to gain access to many different sites and apps. Other types of attacks include key logging, and that's simply, the attacker installs a program and monitors your keystrokes. Phishing and farming, two very popular topics people know about. Less so farming. Phishing briefly, it's when an attacker uses a list of email addresses and delivers a message with a compelling call to action. And that call to action is usually a fake website. And that's what farming is producing these fake websites. So it's a fairly new term that's out there, and you'll probably be hearing it more. But it's really how phishing is advanced into farming. It just sounds fun saying it. And then lastly, you have classic brute force, where the attacker uses a program to generate possible usernames and passwords to gain access, and man-in-the-middle attacks, for instance, by impersonating a public Wi-Fi. So identity theft is really more than stealing data. It's also about destroying data. It's about changing programs or services, holding data hostage, ransomware. I'm sure you hear about it all the time. And it's also about transmitting propaganda, spam, or malicious code. All these can affect your company, and that's why you need to protect against it. Passwords, No longer enough. According to Verizon's 2017 data breach investigations, they were responsible for 81% of attacks. And complex passwords are hard to remember. That's why. And so people often use the same ones across multiple sites. They tend to write them down, and they use common words with easily discoverable information. The top 5 most commonly used password is always password. When you get into the top 10, it's password 1. And when people get a little bit more educated about developing passwords, they'll start using their pet's name with their daughter's birthday, for example. Unfortunately, that also is not a good technique because those things are easily discovered through social engineering on your social websites, which is why multi-factor is a great way to protect against it. People have to utilize multi-factors in order to get a successful authentication. So all the headlines usually are the big name companies, but it's good to know that 31% of the attacks are actually happening to businesses with less than 250 employees. That's a lot of title agencies. Keep that in mind. And going back to phishing attacks being one of the top IT security threats, there is a self-study done by a large integrated healthcare system. I didn't want to do any studies by title companies and reveal their data, but they did 16,000 mock phishing emails to their employees. So these are highly trained healthcare professionals who've have known about their version of MPI for 15 years. So they should know how to protect it. That being said, what they found was 15% of their employees clicked the link. And most damaging, 4% then went to that website and entered their credentials that the attacker could then capture. So that's what we're trying to protect against here with multi-factor. We're also talking about multi-factor because it was recently added as a procedural update in November to ALTA's best practice pillar number 3. And everyone in the title industry is following ALTA's best practices. So they keep us up to date on everything. Thanks, ALTA. Now, how does this attack usually work? So the attacker uses credentials that are vulnerable. As you can see here, someone can't believe the attacker got their credentials. Then the attacker is able to gain access to the network. And at that point, MPI and sensitive data are exposed. This could be anyone. It's in these graphics, it's pretty easy because the attacker has a blindfold and a hat. But it's white collar crime these days. It's anyone sitting at a computer. You can't really identify them. That's why it's so the highest form of crime right now. Okay, so what is multi-factor? It's also known as two-factor, 2FA, some of the acronyms out there. It's pretty basic, something you know, passwords, pins, combinations, code words. And then it's something you have, like a computer or phone. And smartphones have really changed how this is done and brought the cost down and why it's used more often. If you remember back in the day, everyone had to have those token devices and it wasn't used as often, but having a smartphone really helps. And the last thing is something that you are, like fingerprints, palm scanning, facial recognition, etc. All the awesome stuff you used to see on the James Bond movies. So how does multi-factor combat a cyber attack? So you have an attacker here. They send the phishing email. Victim then goes to a false website. I don't know if you guys remember, but one of the popular ones that happened was Keller Williams. It's KW.com. So they would create a site called KVV, kind of looks like KW, and people would falsely enter their credentials. The attacker collects those, but then when they're presented with multi-factor security options, they can't get in and they're blocked. So this is really about looking at your organization and your employees and making sure multi-factor is set up so you're protected. Tips. It's all about making it easy, right? Is it easy to deploy when you're looking at multi-factor? Is it easy to use? And is it easy to manage? Otherwise, no one's going to use it. The first question to consider, and the best one, is where do I already have access to the solution? So are you using Office 365? Are you using a Google application? Are you using an iPhone? So with some of these, it's as simple as just finding the correct location in your settings and flipping a switch and it's on, right? In the title industry, everyone uses title production software. Now, if you're using that on-premise, in your office, not in the cloud, multi-factor takes on a different meaning. Really, at that point, you're looking at making sure your door is locked and using a password to log in. But if you're hosting in the cloud with a various cloud provider, It could be Microsoft Azure, AWS, another commonly used one, OP2. They all offer multi-factor authentication for you to turn on, and highly recommend you do. What you're also looking at here are websites you and your employees commonly use. Banking websites usually have it on automatically for you, but make a list of these and make sure multi-factor is on. Does the solution provide a range of options for you and all your uses? So it's about identifying boundaries. Someone coming into the office versus someone working remotely. Are they in the Citrix environment versus on-premise? All these present different security threats. Does it offer flexibility? If you want to change your mind, can you do that? That's one thing you want to keep in mind. Does it enable you to support user choice and emergency access? Maybe you don't want it anymore, or you're not willing to pay for it. These are things you have to consider. And one of the more exciting ones is, do you need adaptive MFA? I want to talk about that one briefly here. So it is what it says, it adapts to the user. So is the user using a mobile phone? Are they in a different location than they usually are? And ultimately improves their experience. So for example, if a user is logging into your network from a managed computer, they will only be asked to provide one factor of authentication, a password. However, if that user is logging in from an unknown device, from an unknown network, they'll be asked for multiple authentication factors. And that's what adaptive does. Next up is how to implement multi-factor authentication. And this is where I'll hand it off to Chris Hacker.
Hey, Chris, I think you're still muted.
Oh, thank you. I thought I'd unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sounds good.
Awesome, perfect. All right, so when talking about implementation, of an MFA strategy, there's a series of steps, the process to go through. And the first one is, generally referred to as campaign and train. So what does that mean? Well, so this, internally, when you're doing this with your employees, your users, you have to sell it to them, just like you would, sell a customer on a new product. You have to sell it internally and run an effective internal communications campaign, that makes it clear to your users what they need to do, and more importantly, why they need to do it. What it is that you're protecting. And by, if you do this well, that helps to have them avoid seeing it as a nuisance or as a big brother company tracking scheme of some kind. And in terms of doing it well, you need to focus on awareness, right? First, they need to know what you're doing, and what they need to do. So that obviously you'll be announcing it in emails to the company, but posters in the break room, banners in the hallways, all staff meetings where it's discussed. And the key things there is, making sure they're clear what they need to do to make use of it, and where to find the documentation and support in the, when they need it. And then you actually have to provide that support, right? As part of the training. So there needs to be FAQs. You should be having, if your provider should, provide you with, or you need to make training videos, for them to have reference to, and hold training sessions. Those can be optional potentially, but because everybody learns differently, but you want to give multiple modalities for people to be able to figure stuff out. Then you want to start with the admin accounts. So your administrative accounts, are the highest value and most urgent to secure targets. What you have going for you, besides the fact, starting with them, besides that they're the highest value target and you want to secure them, is that the people who have that kind of access tend to be more savvy when it comes to technology, and so are good to use, also good to use as a pilot group. And as going through and identifying who holds those admin accounts, it's an opportunity for you to identify and remove unnecessary privileges that may have been given out in the past to various users, so that you can trim down who has administrative access, as who's going to be part of that initial pilot group. And you want to target, in addition to admin accounts, you want to target key business roles that would have a major security impact. prime example is, the Fortune 500 company, the CEOs and top level executives' email accounts, if they get breached and somebody starts using them to send out emails, that's going to be a real problem for the business. Similarly here, the people who interface directly with the consumer, ultimately are, the closers themselves, the escrow officers, can have a major security impact. So depending on your size and the organization, you can determine where you're going to focus that initial business role collection. And then, when you go through that initial group of the high value targets that you're using as part of these admin accounts, use the lessons that you figure out there in dealing with them and the feedback you get from them to plan out a pilot enrollment or a pilot deployment, including users with different levels of access, so that you can do a small batch. For those of you who are on the medium to larger size, you don't want to go wide out of the gate. You want to do it in stages. So admins and key people, then a pilot with a smattering of people across the board to work out any kinks, and then everybody else. Which brings us to the next one, which is planning for that wider deployment. So while you're running the internal one, you need to figure out what networks or systems are going to be problematic, that are going to require more work for you. If anybody's using SAML authentication, that's if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. But that's something that will take more work. Also, legacy applications that have out-of-date authentication processes. Whether that's something that was built custom, that you built previously, or even stuff like email with where you're connecting using older protocols like IMAP or POP or SMTP. Those are all not up to snuff. So with those kinds of things, once you've identified those systems and networks, then you need to look at upgrading them where possible to support multi-factor. And where you can't upgrade them, then you're gonna want to look at restricting those systems to be used on the local corporate network only, and not have them be able to be accessed or maybe to access outside the internet at large, when that upgrade's not possible. Also, along as part of that, you're going to need to prioritize applications, right? So there's you want it everywhere and you want it with everyone, but you're not going to be able to do that out of the gate. It's not realistic for anyone. So you got to figure out what are your high value systems that you need to make sure are absolutely protected and that have the highest risk. And that's that sort of meeting of those two locations. And then finally, you're gonna, as part of this planning for wider deployment, you need to add the process that you come up with to your new hire process. And so when you bring on somebody new, that you immediately provision them with the multi-factor setup that you've settled on, and then require them to immediately set it up. Ideally, right, whatever their intake is, where they're getting given all their stuff, that they sit there with HR and do it so that they can't get hijacked. You want to make sure you close all the loops there. So once then as far as looking past deployment, you want to make it easier on your employees, and so that you want to consider the use cases that you're going to be implementing around, and use biometrics, hardware keys, or apps on employee devices where possible. If employees are traveling, as far as use cases, if they travel and have connectivity issues, some people have traveling closings where they are in maybe more rural areas where connectivity is not great. You can consider using apps that use something called OAuth codes rather than having push notifications, so that they can generate them internally, as opposed to having to have connectivity. Another option from some providers is automated voice calls, and being able to get a phone call that is automated, that then asks you to put in some code that then authorizes you to give access or to have access. All of those things, and I'll talk about it in a little more detail in a minute, are preferable to anything involving texts. SMS text messages are to be avoided if possible. I'll talk about why in a minute. Back to Steve's earlier set of questions. you want to be able to ideally be able to offer your employees a choice of factors. In particular, you don't necessarily want to require that biometrics are used, fingerprints, retinal scans, facial recognition, because not everybody's comfortable doing that. And the goal here is to get adoption, not to make sure that you have a copy of everybody's fingerprint recorded somewhere. Finally, you want to make sure that you include mobile devices, and when you include mobile devices, that you include it with a mobile device management solution. That's something that would let you control or kill remote devices in the event that they get lost or stolen. And there's different ways to do that. If you're provisioning the phone, for example, or a tablet, and the company owns it, it's not a problem to wipe it. Where it's a bring your own device, there are solutions that let you quarantine a section, in certain applications on there and remotely wipe just that. So you're not able to, delete somebody's photos, let's say, if they, if something happens. Then, second to last, have a support plan. You need to make sure you have a plan to manage account lockouts, because people are going to mess up. They're going to try too many times. They're not going to get it right. They're going to forget something. You need to have a way of doing that that gets them back to work quickly. You need to have a plan for lost devices. You want to make sure that what you put in place is as easy and blame-free as possible, so that they will let you know as soon as they know that they've lost something, so that the sessions and the keys can be invalidated, so nobody can use them for access potentially, and that your IT people can do a quick audit of recent activity, going back to before they think they lost it, just to see if there's any suspicious activity that's happened with that device that got lost. You may want to consider registering more than one device where possible to eliminate downtime. That second device or factor should be more annoying than the primary one. That way they can still get in, but it will prompt them to report the primary device lost before, rather than just keep doing the annoying thing. And lastly, you want to make sure that you've got it set up to automatically deprovision when employees either change roles or leave the company. Lastly, you need to measure and monitor. So, as you implement this and after you implement it, you want to keep track of security metrics for failed login attempts, blocked credential phishing, denied privilege escalations. You want to continue to your multi-factor authentication program marketing, both during and after the deployment. You want to host sessions to collect feedback, or send out email polls to find out how it's going for people. Start that with your pilot group and expand it into the larger rollout. But you don't just want to rely on your employees to tell you what's going on. You want to track internal help desk tickets if you have those, the logs of what's going on, and also productivity measures like turn times, on title orders. If you see stuff starting to get longer, then it's an indication it's having a negative impact on productivity. Something's not right with the setup, and it gives you an opportunity to intervene. Once you have it rolled out, you need to test updates to softwares that, as you roll them out, to confirm they don't break your MFA solution. And then, as with everything, and as said in other calls about various other kinds of security, you have to test your employees. You have to keep retraining them, but you have to test them with phishing training, so that they know what it is that they're looking for, and then you got to try and phish them. From time to time, send them something and see who clicks, and hopefully you can get that, that 15 and 4% lower. But at a minimum, for the one, if you get all the way to the 4% with MFA in place, they're not going to actually be able to create the exposure. So what are some best practices to ensure that workflow efficiency? Well, first, you need to understand your requirements. Then assess your applications, choose the factors and distribution tactics that fit your strategy, and take mobile security measures. So with respect to the requirements, first you need to know, what's your purpose here? Why are you implementing this? Are you trying to protect corporate access? Are you trying to secure consumer-facing web portals? Or are you doing both? I would say for most people here, it's not so much about the consumer-facing portals, it's about internal corporate access. That you're trying to create a boundary. Where are you putting the fencing? And then you need to identify your organization's processes and functionalities. What are the use cases that are going to be involved. How do your employees work together? How do employees and consumers authenticate into applications? Where and how is information accessed? And most importantly, where and how is your sensitive data accessed, and to make sure that you have that those things in place. Then use the use cases to identify the applications that you want to integrate. I mean, ultimately the goal is all users across all applications, and required again when users attempt to escalate privileges. But in the realm of the real world where you have to prioritize, you're going to start with the ones that are high risk, high reward, and go from there. Now, assessing your applications, two things to call out there. One, you want a consistent authentication process if possible. So the more of your applications that can be protected by the same experience, then the less solutions you need, so the lower cost. And the more consistent of the experience it is, the better experience you provide to your users, the less complaining, the less problems that it presents. Also, you can consider single sign-on where possible. So single sign-on is where some of you are familiar with, where you can have people log into a particular portal, and then from inside there, they're in a protected zone, and things that they do from inside there are authenticated. And then you can apply the multi-factor to the single sign-on, so that you have but they can, you still require 2 factors to get into the protected environment. But once you're in the protected environment, you don't need to invoke the multi-factor as often. That also requires less credentials and all that sort of thing. That said, some people are familiar, use something like Citrix to connect into their, for their title production software and other internal network things. You still have issues that you have to take into account there, where as soon as people launch a web browser inside that environment, you've now created risk and a way for things to get access to that protected environment. So still need to look at, for third-party solutions or third-party softwares that you're accessing, like your bank, other outside vendors, where they can implement multi-factor, and also consider, what kinds of activities people are doing inside the Citrix environment, and whether that should be happening inside or outside that Citrix environment for security purposes. Then you want to consider what factors and distribution tactics are going to work for you. So there's lots of different options for that second authentication factor. There are hardware tokens, things that look like USB devices that you stick in your computer that provide the credentials. There's software you can install and run that will generate the tokens on your machine. You can use security questions. SMS text messages are a factor that many of us are familiar with, although it's deprecated now. It's not something people recommend anymore. I'll talk about why shortly. Biometrics, fingerprints, eye scan, retinal scans, face recognition, and then sending emails and phone calls. Those are all different ways of dealing with it. And when we talk about adaptive multi-factor authentication, then you're using more than just one other one, and you're using it depending on what you're trying to do. So you want to consider what works best with the needs of your user population, and then you want to figure out how you're going to, get the methods out to your users. So you need to model, your channels and map your use cases so that you can make sure that you've covered your bases. Next is to take mobile security measures. So the mobile devices are the new network perimeter, right? The people who use them, there's really no way to prevent it from being used in some form or fashion, but there are things that you can do. One, we've talked about before. I talked about before about the mobile device management stuff, where if they're going to use it, they have to install something in their device, even if it's their own, that's going to protect a portion of the data on the device. Next is to avoid text messages where possible, because text messages can be socially engineered or compromised, with device theft, swapping out the SIM card, cloning it, or even up to carrier account hijacking. So text messages are sort of a one of last resort. It should be a tertiary, factor, not the secondary one, if possible. You want to consider alternatives such as push authentication, biometric capabilities, or even the authentication apps. Google provides a free one, so does Microsoft. There's a bunch of other ones out there as well. And lastly, at a minimum encourage, and maybe as a policy for you to decide internally, to require the employees to lock their phones automatically, with requiring not a code, but their fingerprint. Set the time on those password locks to or timeouts to a short period of time, 30 seconds, and enable that mobile device management, remote wipe, and recovery. So that's the sort of list of best practices. Then in surveying what's we've seen, and also what's out in the market, as far as reporting back what people have learned. The first thing is to implement multi-factor everywhere. If you only partially deploy it in the organization, it doesn't provide enough of a fence. You really need to encircle, and completely encircle your company with it, so that in order to get in, you need that secondary factor, or a secondary factor. Whether to Steve's earlier point, it's not just your password, but it's also the key to the front door, or a key card to get into the office, or on the one hand, or it's a fob, or even a text message. You need something more than just the password. Second, if you can, use adaptive MFA. That's going to make it a better user experience, and also increase your security. It'll lower the burden on things that matter less and raise it on the things that matter more. Third, trying to provide that choice of multi-factor methods. When people can elect how they want to do something, you're going to have less complaints and much easier adoption of when they're involved in some choice along those lines. Additionally, if you combine multi-factor with single sign-on and least privilege access policies, then you further reduce the risk of compromised data, because you're further reducing the stuff that is available in the event of a breach. Then you need to continuously reevaluate it. You have to make sure that what you did actually meets the needs of the organization, and be ready to change it. Both the technology changes, as well as your processes change. Maybe you didn't consider something, you need to make adjustments. So it's not a one size fits all, one time kind of thing. Lastly, less of a specific, like a general comment, more of a specific one. You need to make sure that you manage for that emergency access options. You lose your phone, you're in an admin account and you need to get in. All the solutions have secondary access options, things like one-time use codes that you can store somewhere securely, that you would maybe need to go physically get, so that you can get in. They shouldn't be easy, but you should have a way that you're not locked out if your phone's dead, and you need to get in, or you lose your phone. All right, so that was the long-ish, detailed dive through the process. Now the question: so you do all this work, is it enough? Well, unfortunately, I don't think everybody's familiar with Dave. By now, he's been a frequent member of a lot of these conferences, or these conference calls, these webinars, training. But no, the answer is no, it's not good enough. It's important, you need to do it, but that doesn't do the job. What else do you need to do? You need to follow, Pillar 3 best practices, which I'm sure you all are. You need to look at how you can combine MFA with other identity security solutions, such as single sign-on and the least privilege access. You should be looking at consolidating passwords with a password manager. Part of the reason that passwords are no longer good enough is because we can't remember them. If you use a password manager, like LastPass is the one that we use, that then you can, the software creates things you can't remember, that are 16, 24, 48 characters long, are effectively uncrackable with, given the way that most sites are set up, and make sure that you don't have to remember it, but keep it encrypted anyway, and allow you to share them, where it's appropriate. So it's a very useful, very way to up the security, beyond just adding multi-factor. Next, adopting a social media policy. Multi-factor authentication, when it's exploited, is most often exploited through social engineering. So what do we mean by that? Well, back to the text messages, right? If I know that if I want to get into your network, and I know you've set up multi-factor, obviously that's made it harder, but I'm really determined. And I find out or that I managed to phish somebody and get their credentials, but I still can't get in because there's that second factor. But I know I find out the person's through that phishing attempt, I find out their phone number, and I text them something that looks like it's valid because I can spoof it. And they do something that then gives me access to their phone. And then when they actually go get their next factor, I can see it in real time and use it. That kind of thing, is part of that social engineering. So you want to, have a social media policy and train people on it as far as what they should be exposing, what they shouldn't be exposing in social media themselves, and then, reduce the likelihood that somebody is going to be able to guess those things. That said, people are going to use it. So the last thing is train, test, and retrain, right? So you're going to train them on what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, not just for MFA, but on phishing and preventing leaking their credentials. And then you need to test them. You need to send them those. You need to try and trick them to see because better if you trick them and then retrain them than if somebody else does. All right, so is it good enough? No technology today provides a 100% fail-safe system. However, it does and will enhance the confidence of consumers and customers. And it will significantly raise the obstacles for would-be attackers. Why is that important? Well, we all know you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun the other campers, right? So this is an arms race, and you need to not be the low-hanging fruit. So MFA puts you ahead of the game. It's where people are moving to but have not moved to, and people who are trying to get into your systems will go to the easiest one to get into. And so having an implemented multi-factor strategy in place makes you harder than the person who doesn't, and therefore lowers your profile as something that they going to want to go after. So with that, we can take any questions that may have been submitted or that you have now.
All right, yeah, thanks, Chris and Steve, for some of the great insight on how those on the call can approach implementation of MFA. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to hold some time for Q&A. Please submit your questions in the questions box, and we'll pitch them over to Chris and Steve. We have had a few of them come in so far. We'll just kind of start off at the top here. John asked if you could confirm, there's a couple of points where you could implement MFA, but his question is if this MFA is more for internal company protection and not for confirmation of other parties involved in the transaction, buyers, sellers, lenders. But the second part, is there a way to combat wire fraud externally with MFA? Wire fraud is a growing concern, and the industry has been over the past couple of years, and the FBI just released their latest fraud report, which shows that losses due to wire fraud grew from 150 million in 2018 to over 220 million over the past year. So any recommendations on way to combat wire fraud externally with MFA?
Sure, I'll take the question. So the first part of the question was, is this for internal, or external? It can be for both. I mean, a bank, your bank account is a good example where it's, being used for external, interfacing with the consumer. That's the customer of the bank. That said, you want to secure your own house first, right? It's not any good to make the consumer jump through hoops if the back door is open. So the focus initially is internal, and then and there's some issues with trying to use MFA itself as a strategy to manage something like wire fraud, because the way that it would work is the first time you're sending it out to them, there's no second factor established, there's no identity established. You send it to an email that they need to go somewhere, and then you implement multi-factor, which means once they've done that, things after that are protected, but it doesn't guarantee that they are who you think they are. And so there's still that identity issue, involved. So technology doesn't yet solve everything. That's as far as ways to deal with or protect for wire fraud, or protect from wire fraud, redirection of wires, that sort of thing. There are solutions that will provide additional security around that. I mean, the key focus is changing the behavior and making sure that that the recipient of those wire instructions is getting what you sent them and not ending up with something else. The thing over the last 5 years, where it's just gone through the roof, has really been a result of people sending emails with that was the traditional behavior. I will email you my wire instructions. And then if they or a trusted party, the realtor, occasionally the title company, gets compromised, then that the bad actor is able to then leverage that appearance of identity of it being a trusted third party or trusted party in the transaction to change the wire instructions. If you get it out of email and you don't email them anymore, that cuts that off at the knees. So making sure that it's always the same thing, can't be changed. There are solutions that can do that. It wasn't all that long ago. I mean, we're happy that we're having this call about MFA and that there are people attending it, because it wasn't 2 years ago that we had customers asking us, title agencies asking us to remove the passwords from the links to access documents. They wanted just to be able to click a link, the consumer to be able to click a link in an email and access NPI, and we refused. We actually lost a number of customers as a result of not doing that, because we were unwilling to reduce the security. Things have come a long way in that time. So I think we've that hits both the questions.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, definitely don't want unprotected URLs with access to NPI. Question from Kristen on having MFA on closing software. What should she do if their closing software does not have a MFA capability yet?
Well, so I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on how do you access it. Is it an on-premise solution, that is not accessible except unless you're on-premise? Then that being on-premise is your second factor. If you're remoting into it using a VPN or something of that nature, remote desktop, you can apply the factor to that connection rather than to the title production software. If it's a cloud-based one, or if it's hosted by somebody, if it's on-premise, could be on-premise, but it's not on your premises, it's on somebody else's premises, then that provider who's providing that hosting solution would be the one that you would need to provide that second factor. And then, if it's a web-based, interaction, again, you'd need to talk to the vendor there about that, because if I can hit it from a browser from anywhere, that's when you need that. You definitely need that second factor in place. So I would talk to your vendors, about the particular solutions that you have, to the extent that they are in fact off premises.
All right, and Kristen had a follow-up question, and Kristen, I can't answer it off the top of my head. She was asking if going through a remote desktop connection is compliant with Pillar 3. If you want follow-up with me after the webinar, Kristen, and we can get that answered for you.
I would say generally, as far as not I'm not opining specifically on Pillar 3, but in terms of security practices and vendor risk management, it can be, provided that you have the proper security policies in place, and that.
Yeah, I think you're right on with that comment, Chris. Sharice has a question on the you were mentioning password managers. What was the name? I know one of the common ones, LastPass.
LastPass. Yeah.
LastPass. All right.
Yeah, I think the idea behind that is it's the last password you'll need. You have one master password, and then it decrypts all of your other passwords.
Okay.
And they sell corporate account, business accounts. It's like, I think something like $12 a year for a user, so it's pretty cheap for what it does. There are a few others out there. Trying to think, Authy I think is one that might has both. If it's not Authy itself, Authy's like has a sister or a sibling product that does password management. There's a few others. I haven't looked recently because we've been using LastPass for a couple years now.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from David, and phone usage for employees. So say an employee adds their company Outlook Exchange account to their cell phone, and currently the only password access emails is the phone locking function with which they require. Would the emails be subject to MFA as they may contain NPI? If yes, how?
So that gets into the mobile device management type stuff. And depending on what, if you're using an Exchange server or if you're using, Office 365, there are settings that you can put in place that don't automatically allow somebody to connect through certain protocols without approval or without the right kinds of credentials beyond just their password. So you could turn those on. One, to prevent them from just adding it willy-nilly, and then it becomes part of a provisioning process where you give them those credentials after they install the software that lets you partition their device to create a section of it that is subject to your control.
Okay. This is kind of more of just a general question, and I don't know if you have any data on the top of your head, but Deborah was wondering, how is the most data stolen?
Well, what we've seen, from doing when we're prepping for this, was that, like something like, what did we say at the beginning, Steve? It was like 31% of the breaches happen because a password is the only factor and it's cracked.
Well, 31% was for for companies of less than 250, and it was 87%, 81%.
Oh, 81%.
Yeah,
81%.
That was the Verizon study.
Yeah. So, most of them are because somehow somebody gives up their password, whether they get phished and you then give them inadvertently give the either because they've got malware that's feeding out their keystrokes, or they've got they go to a site that they think is legit and it's not, and they put their credentials in. Those the sort of affirmative, I did something that now lets you have my password, or they use insecure passwords. So back to the password one, or daisies and birth date combinations. So that's really like, this is now the low hanging, the highest leverage activity you can do is to put a second factor on, because then those passwords, while you can still make them stronger and use something like LastPass or something like that to a password manager to allow for using complex passwords that you don't have to remember, by adding the second factor, it becomes irrelevant. In the first instance, the strength of that password, because you need that second factor. And if you're using something that's like an application that's generating it based on some algorithm that's hidden, then it's impossible for somebody to guess it. They actually have to have the device or be on the device to get it. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, just in case multi-factor isn't available for a certain application, or you don't have access to something like LastPass, it's good to talk about password creation, and it's been shown that using like various characters and using numbers that look like a letter, like 3 for E and stuff like that, isn't effective, because these hackers could just employ programs that try all these all at once. If you've ever gotten a new modem from the cable company, they use a combination of words with some numbers that like Canyon Blue Room 4627 or something, right? And it's just like 2 words that you never would think come together that you really couldn't come up with a program. Is a better way to create a password. I know this call isn't about creating passwords, but if you find yourself in a bind where you don't have LastPass or multi-factor, think of that practice when creating a password.
Yeah, another one is creating some sort of sentence or phrase, and then selecting letters out of that sentence or phrase, sort of a mnemonic device that creates a randomized, password, but it's not something that's going to be able to be, broken with a brute force dictionary attack.
Yeah, I think the FIEC late last year came out with some new guidance on passwords. You can check out ALTA's blog for more information on that, or just send me an email and I can get you the information on tips on passwords. Interesting, just the phishing schemes that are out there and how innocuous some of these emails can be. And I'll just share a random story of my own. I told Steve and Chris this on our pre-call. I was checking emails one morning, on my phone, trying to get an early jump start on the day. Email said someone tried to purchase, something, an Apple product or something. So of course I clicked the link, and to my surprise, it was a phishing email. Fortunately, it was a test that we at ALTA, our IT department, sends to staff, and the unfortunate ones who fall victim to this has to watch a phishing video to improve our online hygiene. So there you go. Question about biometrics. So if that's the MFA that's being used, where's that data stored, like the eye scans and fingerprints? Any thoughts on that?
It depends on the solution that you're using. So if you have an Android or an Apple phone and you've enabled fingerprint as an identifier for you, it's stored on the device, right? So it takes the image that it creates a number for it that matches your fingerprint, calculate whatever the calculation is, does, and stores it locally, internally, encrypted. So the next time you come and use your finger or your eye, it does the math again and says, does it match? And if it does, then lets you in. You want to stick with stuff like that, preferably. That you don't want to be centralizing that stuff. That would allow for somebody, if there was some sort of critical breach where somebody got inside your network all the way in, and you were storing it, they could walk away with all that information. Alternatively, if it's a provider and they're storing it, same thing, right? So, I think people have cause to a certain extent to be cautious about biometrics. That said, I fingerprint lock my phone. I used my fingerprint to unlock my computer. But one of the things that Android got right, I'm less familiar with Apple, but if you turn your phone off, your fingerprint doesn't unlock it when you turn it back on again. You have to put the password in. So there still is that 2-factor to protect you from that kind of thing.
Have you ever had any issues with the fingerprint though on the Apple? I had times try to use it doesn't recognize it, so then I end up just putting the password in.
Yeah, I mean, the way it's done, at least with respect to the devices, is generally more of a convenience than a second factor. That said, there are I think applications that will require both to launch, or you could set it to require both,
right,
to launch.
All right. Just a reminder, any questions? We are getting close to the top of the hour, close to wrapping up. Just submit them in the questions box. We do have one more that's in from Jeff, and it was more on the mobile devices, and is asking, while VPN is not technically an MFA solution for mobile devices, is it an acceptable solution if the VPN password is different than the normal login credentials?
I mean, you know, so this is all about risk management, right? So, you know, if you go and say, is that multi-factor? You know, I'd say no. Is it better than not doing it? Yes. You know, if that's the only option you have for the moment, then that's better than not doing anything. But I wouldn't stop there. What you need, you know, the whole idea with the factor, you want to separate it from, you know, you want something from two of those three categories. The something you know, that's a password. Something you have, like your device, or something you are, like your biometrics. You want to select across those things, because if I can know your password, then I can know your other password potentially. You know, it's not until you get that, cross that boundary into, you know, something that I have or that you have that I don't have, or something that you are that I don't have, like your finger, that you actually start getting the security. So yeah, double passwords, triple passwords, you know, makes it harder for your employee as well. And it doesn't necessarily really raise the boundary or the barrier as much as crossing that boundary between the other factors.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks again, Chris and Steve. For those of you still on the call, if you missed parts of today's webinar, you think others in your office would benefit from listening, recording of the presentation will be provided. You'll get an email with a link to the recording tomorrow. And again, just a reminder, all of our webinars are archived on ALTA's website at alta.org/title topics. Looking ahead to next month, we will offer our first compliance webinar of the year. During this presentation, we will be discussing what agents should do and consider during a claims investigation. So this should be an interesting conversation. With that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. To wrap up, I need to thank FNF family of companies once again for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars. I'd also like to remind everyone to make sure their company is confirmed in the ALTA registry. Just because you're an ALTA member or a Policy Forms license holder doesn't mean your company is automatically in the registry. So go to alta.org/registry for more info and to confirm if your company's in it. Again, thank you to Chris and Steve for taking the time and talking about multi-factor authentication. Take care, everyone.